The night was dark and silent, the kind of night when you can hear your own heartbeat. I was in the trophy room, just finishing up my work for the day. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Aunt Delta and one of the maids came running in, their faces white with terror. Aunt Delta was holding a small pistol, her hand trembling as she pointed it at the door behind them. The maid locked the door quickly, and Aunt Delta rushed to the phone, her voice shaking as she called for security. "What happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. Aunt Delta's eyes were wide with fear. "A man high on drugs broke in through the back window of the jungle room. He was after us," she said, her voice breaking. "He threatened to kill us if we didn't let him stay." I felt a chill run down my spine. The jungle room, with its lush plants and exotic decor, was usually a peaceful place. Now it was the scene of a nightmare. The man had smashed through the window, breaking the bars with a crowbar, and had chased Aunt Delta and the maid into her bedroom. She had grabbed the gun from her nightstand and had threatened to shoot him, but he just kept coming, pleading for her to go ahead and do it. The two women had managed to escape, dashing out of the bedroom and running to the trophy room. Within minutes, security arrived, followed by a swarm of police cars. The man was eventually subdued and taken away, but the shock of it all lingered. It wasn't the first time Graceland had faced security issues. A few years earlier, 2 yard men had been fired for using grapes from the arbor near the pool to make wine. Another security guard had let a couple claiming to be long-lost family members into the house, only for them to wander into Elvis' bedroom. And there was the time a security guard had been caught exposing himself to Lisa and her friends near the barn. But this was different. This was a real threat, and it shook us to our core. Graceland, the beautiful mansion that Elvis Presley called home, was a place of warmth and joy, but it also had its dark moments. The mansion was a small city in itself, with a large staff to keep everything running smoothly. There were yard men, contractors, electricians, painters, carpenters, maids, cooks, secretaries, security guards, animal keepers, and maintenance workers. Hiring and firing was a constant cycle, and keeping good help was always a challenge. Despite the turmoil, Graceland was a place of love and laughter. Elvis was a kind and caring man, always making sure his family and employees felt safe and valued. I remember the day Priscilla went into labor. The entire household was a flurry of activity, with bags and suitcases packed and ready. Elvis was a bundle of nerves, kissing Dodger on the head as she reassured him. When Lisa Marie was born, the joy was palpable. Elvis beamed with pride, declaring, "I love my little girl to death. We're going to have 20 children." Lisa Marie brought a new light to Graceland. The nursery, a beautiful room decorated in yellow and white, became a sanctuary of love. Elvis and Lisa's bond was special. He would spend hours playing with her, marveling at her beauty, and letting her pretend to be the mommy as she fed him on his massive bed. The sound of their laughter was a constant reminder of the happiness that could still be found in the midst of chaos. But that night, as I stood in the trophy room with Aunt Delta and the maid, the fear was real. We had faced a nightmare, and it had reminded us that even in a place as magical as Graceland, danger could lurk in the shadows. Yet, despite it all, the love and warmth of the Presley family shone through, a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. Lisa's childhood was a lot like that of any other kid, with the usual ups and downs. She had her favorite foods like macaroni and cheese, creamed potatoes, and fried chicken. But milk was a tough sell. She would beg for Pepsi or orange juice instead. We managed to get her to drink milk sometimes by adding chocolate syrup, which made it a bit more tolerable for her. Lisa's sweet tooth was no secret, especially since her dad, Elvis, loved sweets too. She would beg me to make her favorite dessert, chocolate cake with vanilla ice cream. We tried to keep her sugar intake in check, but as she grew older, she got smarter about it. She would come downstairs and say, "Mom said I could have some cake." We knew better, and Priscilla was always quick to back us up when we said no. Elvis, though, was a soft touch, and would spoil her without thinking twice. One of Lisa's favorite treats was having meals served in her bedroom. On the round, hamburger-shaped bed Elvis had bought for her. It was a copy of the one he had in his dressing room. Her bed was even fancier, with a built-in radio and TV, and steps leading up to it. She loved lying back and watching herself in the mirror on the canopy while she ate. Lisa was always a strong, independent girl. Even when she was little, she would get upset if we tried to baby her. "Don't call me a baby, I'm not a baby," she would scream. She didn't like being touched or petted, and combing her hair could be a challenge. Like most little girls, Lisa loved playing with makeup and dressing up in grown-up clothes. She would rummage through Priscilla's or Aunt Delta's closets, trying on high heels and dresses that were way too big for her. One day, she got into Priscilla's makeup kit and went through nearly every tube of lipstick. I spent hours cleaning up the mess. Lisa was a good swimmer and loved the pool at Graceland. Aunt Delta and I would sit by the pool chatting while we kept an eye on her. I couldn't swim, so I'd sit at the shallow end, and Aunt Delta, who could swim, would be ready to jump in if needed. One day, Lisa dove to the bottom of the deep end and stayed there for what seemed like forever. I was terrified and started screaming, "Lisa, are you okay, honey?" Just as I was about to jump in, she popped up with a big grin, yelling, "I heard you all along. I was just seeing how long I could hold my breath." I was so relieved, but also a bit annoyed. Despite her mischievous side, Lisa was a sweet and caring girl. She had a special bond with Minnie-Me, her grandmother. Lisa would visit Minnie-Me's room and ask, "How are you today, Grandma?" If Minnie-Me said she wasn't feeling well, Lisa would genuinely express her concern. She was also close to Vernon, her grandfather, whom she called Papa. They shared warm smiles and hugs whenever she was around. Lisa's relationship with Aunt Delta was more complicated. She once told me, "I like Aunt Delta, but she cusses too much." After Elvis passed away, Lisa didn't want to stay at Graceland when she visited Memphis. She preferred staying at her cousin Patsy's house. She had an incident where she and a friend heard noises outside Aunt Delta's bedroom window, which scared her. She also felt uncomfortable in the house, knowing that her father had died there. One day, Lisa came running into the house crying. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, and she wouldn't go near Aunt Delta. We called Patsy to talk to her, and found out that Lisa had overheard Aunt Delta saying unflattering things about Priscilla's plans to open Graceland to the public. Lisa had confronted Aunt Delta and argued with her, saying, "You don't like anybody, you just cuss them out behind their back." Things were back to normal after a few days, but the incident left a lasting impression. Lisa's favorite pastime was riding around Graceland in the small blue golf cart Elvis had made for her. She would drive it as fast as it would go, sometimes on 2 wheels, and explore the grounds with her friends. One time, she drove the cart over to the side wall and told a fan looking over, "IOW in this place, it's all mine." She then drove off, as I scrambled to call security. One of Lisa's nurses got fired after she took one of Elvis's golf carts for a spin and crashed it into the front rock wall. She had to go to the hospital, and Priscilla fired her when she got back. The nurse who replaced her was elderly and often tired, so Aunt Delta and I would end up babysitting Lisa. We spent many evenings on the David and Lisa's room, talking about everything under the sun as we waited for her to fall asleep. When Lisa got bored, she and a friend would play a game with the phone, making up random numbers and calling them. They would engage in silly conversations, like asking if the person's house was on the bus line. I often wondered what the person on the other end thought if they knew they were talking to the daughter of Elvis Presley. Lisa's early years were filled with both joy and challenges. She could make a mess in a heartbeat, like the time she smeared makeup all over her face. I yelled, "Lord, have mercy, child," and for weeks afterward, I would hear her little voice yelling the same thing. We all treated Lisa's growth like it was our own child's. When she left for California after the divorce, it felt like losing a family member. We were always happy when she came back to visit, and even after she got married to Danny Keogh, we still felt responsible for her. She had some problems early in the marriage and would call Graceland, crying and asking to speak to Aunt Delta. At first, Aunt Delta was sympathetic, but eventually she stopped taking the calls. I felt uncomfortable being in the middle, but I always tried to be there for Lisa. When Lisa married Michael Jackson, people were surprised. I always believed they were really married, but I didn't think Michael could be a father to her children. Their marriage lasted 18 months, and I was glad Michael never tried to use Lisa for any bad reasons. I think Elvis wouldn't have approved of that marriage. Lisa's first and true love, in my opinion, is Danny, the father of her 2 children. Then Lisa married Nicolas Cage, but that marriage was short-lived. My hope for Lisa is that she finds happiness and contentment someday. I hold onto that dream for her, despite the challenges she has faced. That Tuesday morning started like any other, with the heat and humidity of a Memphis summer already setting in. I got to work early, around 6 a.m., and the air was already thick with the promise of another sweltering day. An early morning rain had done little to cool things down. When I walked into Graceland, Pauline told me that Elvis and Ginger were out back in the racquetball court with Elvis's cousin, Billy Smith, and Billy's wife, Jo. I put my things away, and soon Elvis, Billy, and Ginger came in through the back door. It was around 6:30, and Elvis looked like he had been working up a sweat. "Mr. Elvis, can I fix you something to eat?" I asked. "No thanks, Nancy," he replied. "I'm not hungry right now, but I'm really thirsty and would really like some ice water. And then all I want to do is get some sleep." They disappeared up the back stairway, and I fixed him a glass of ice water. Pauline took it upstairs to him. When she came back, she said, "He practically grabbed the water out of my hand." I thought it was a bit odd, but didn't give it much more thought. Pauline left, and I was left alone for the day. I had to do everything by myself, because the other cook didn't show up. Aunt Delta offered to help with the cleaning, but she didn't like to cook, so I knew I'd be doing most of the work. I went about my usual routine. I cleaned Mrs. Minnie's room, then Aunt Delta's, and dusted the den and living room downstairs. I fixed Mrs. Minnie some lunch, and we had a quick cup of coffee together. She then went back to her bedroom. Pauline had told me before she left that Elvis had a restless night, which was common before a tour. He and Ginger had gone out the night before, riding his motorcycle to take his mind off the stress. They rode for hours around Whitehaven, where they could avoid being recognized by fans. They returned home after 10 o'clock. Elvis had wanted to rent a local theater to watch a movie, but it didn't work out. Ricky brought spaghetti and meatballs from Pizza Hut for everyone, but I'm not sure if Elvis ate any. Later, Elvis and Ginger went to his dentist for some routine work and came back to Graceland an hour later. Elvis was not in a good mood. He was worried about a new book by his former bodyguards that had just come out. The upcoming tour would be his first time facing fans after the book's release, and he was anxious about how they would react. He and Ginger had also been arguing about whether she would join him on the tour. They were in Lisa's room arguing when Mary Jenkins walked in. It was a tense night for Elvis. They decided to play racquetball to help him calm down. That's where they were when I came in. I didn't hear from Elvis again after he went upstairs. I remember Ricky and Aunt Delta taking some of his medications to him that morning. Elvis had health problems, including insomnia and chronic pain, and he relied on medications to manage them. Over the years, his use of prescription drugs had become more intense, but it was so routine that it didn't seem unusual. I finished my chores and sat at the kitchen counter to watch a soap opera. Suddenly, the intercom phone rang from Elvis's bedroom. I picked it up, expecting to hear Elvis's sleepy voice, but it was Ginger, and she sounded very worried. "Is Ricky, Al, or any of the bodyguards close by?" she asked. "I'm the only one in the kitchen," I replied. Aunt Delta went to the store, and Al is on his way back from Walgreens. Ginger started sobbing. Something is terribly wrong with Elvis. I tried to calm her down, but she was almost hysterical. I hung up and ran up the back stairs, across the landing, and turned right into the hallway. The doors to Elvis's bedroom were closed, so I rushed past them and turned right, down the hallway, and into his dressing room. I could see his reflection in a mirror. He was lying on the floor, face down in the red shag carpet, as if he had tried to stand up and then fallen. I was in pure panic. I knew I had to get help. I ran back downstairs and saw Al Strato walking in through the back door. He could see the panic in my eyes and knew something was wrong. I screamed that Elvis was unconscious on the bathroom floor. Al ran upstairs, and I waited at the bottom of the stairs, feeling helpless. Joe Esposito came running in, and Al and Joe headed back upstairs. Vernon and his niece, Patsy, came through the patio door, both visibly shaking. Vernon was crying, repeating, "Lord save him, Lord please save my boy." They disappeared up the stairs. Charlie Hodge walked in, not aware of what was happening. He went for a cup of coffee, but saw Vernon's distress. I screamed, "Charlie, this is no joke. Something is wrong with Mr. Elvis." Charlie's face went white, and he headed upstairs. I stayed downstairs waiting for the ambulance. I opened the front door and showed the medical technicians where to go. They took the stretcher upstairs and disappeared into the commotion. Elvis was more than just my boss. He was like a brother and a good friend. The thought of losing him was almost too much to bear. I tried to keep my emotions in check, hoping that somehow we could save him. But deep down, I knew we had done everything we could. The rest was in God's hands. That day, everyone in the house was clinging to the hope that everything would be okay. Elvis had been sick before and he always pulled through, but this time felt different. After about 15 minutes, I heard a commotion. They were bringing Elvis down on a stretcher. His weight made it hard to maneuver in the small room at the top of the stairs. I stood in the foyer, and as they brought him down, I noticed he was wearing a blue pajama top, unbuttoned, and they had covered him with a thin blue sheet up to his chest. His face looked like he was sleeping, but it was blue and distorted, and he wasn't moving at all. I knew in my heart that he was gone. The pain in my soul was indescribable. It felt like all the life was sucked out of Graceland, and nothing would ever be the same again. They carried Elvis out to the ambulance, which was parked facing south, toward the meditation garden. Al, Joe, and one of the paramedics jumped in the back, and the other paramedic got behind the wheel. Just as the ambulance was about to pull away, Dr. Nishapoulos arrived and jumped in too. They closed the door, and the ambulance sped off down the driveway, through the gates, and headed to the hospital. The only sound was the wailing siren and my racing heartbeat. Vernon didn't have the strength to go to the hospital. I think he, like the rest of us, was slowly giving up hope. Later, Ginger came down the stairs crying. She was fully dressed and had her makeup on. Vernon and I were at the bottom of the stairs, and he asked her what had happened. Ginger said she had fallen asleep early, but Elvis was restless and went to the bathroom to read. When she woke up hours later, Elvis wasn't in bed. She called out for him but got no response. She saw the light under the bathroom door and thought he was still reading. She knocked several times, still no response, so she opened the door and found Elvis on the floor. She ran to the bedroom and called me on the intercom phone. I asked her why it took her so long to check on him. She sobbed, I don't know. I was sleeping and couldn't wake up." Vernon and Ginger weren't on good terms. I think he saw her as someone who didn't have Elvis's best interests in mind. Later, I had lunch with Ginger and felt more sympathetic. She was young and probably in over her head. That day, Vernon took charge. He told Ginger to leave the house. She packed her small white bag, cried, and rushed out the back door. She never really moved in, unlike some others. After the ambulance left, Aunt Delta, Vernon, Patsy, and others gathered in Dodger's bedroom, crying and trying to comfort each other. Dodger stayed in her rocking chair, in grief, waiting for news. Aunt Delta, being practical, asked me to go upstairs and get rid of Elvis's medications and needles before the police arrived. I followed her orders, gathering everything into a plastic bag. We changed the sheets on Elvis's bed and replaced the towels in the bathroom. We tried to make it look normal. I realized I hadn't seen Lisa. I found her in her bedroom, crying with a cousin and a friend. I begged her to come out, and after a while she did. I held her and took her downstairs to be with her family. She was a young girl, and it was hard for her. Dr. Nick and the paramedics came back to Graceland. Dr. Nick went into Dodger's room and told the family that Elvis had died at the hospital. Chaos erupted. Everyone was crying and screaming. Vernon was in the hallway crying, "My baby is gone. My baby is gone." He looked so lost. The news of Elvis's death spread quickly. By 3:30, the national news had broken the story. The phones started ringing nonstop. Calls came from all over, and the phone system eventually shut down. Elvis was gone, and the world mourned. Graceland became a place of tribute, with thousands of fans and floral arrangements. It was a sad day, and everyone had to find their own way to cope with the loss. The king was gone, and there would never be another like him. The next day, Wednesday, August 17th, felt like a day we could all have done without. The sun was up, but it didn't bring any warmth or comfort. We all woke up to the stark reality that yesterday's events were not a dream. Elvis was really gone, and now he was coming home to Graceland to lie in state before his burial the next day. I had left Graceland late the night before, and I barely got any sleep. The few hours I did manage were filled with restless, disturbing thoughts. As I drove back to Graceland that morning, the streets were already crowded with people. The mood was different from the day before. There was a heavy, somber silence. Fans from all over the country were gathered, paying their respects to Elvis. Men and women, young and old, were crying openly. It was like the entire world was mourning with us. The news crews were everywhere, trying to get interviews. I felt bad for them, but I couldn't bring myself to talk. Even though Elvis was gone, the habit of keeping his life private was hard to break. I just didn't feel like talking to anyone. When I got inside Graceland, the house was quiet. Priscilla and Lisa had arrived late the night before, and were now asleep in one of the bedrooms. The kitchen was filled with the usual staff, quietly preparing for the day ahead. I had expected chaos, but everyone was just trying to keep things as normal as possible. It was a small comfort in a sea of grief. Grandma Presley came into the kitchen a little while later. She barely touched her breakfast, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She kept saying, "I just can't believe my baby is gone. It's not fair. This can't be real." Her words broke my heart. I had to leave the room a few times to keep from crying in front of her. She was in enough pain as it was. Vernon came in not long after, looking as devastated as Grandma. They embraced each other, both trying to find some comfort, but it was clear they were both in deep pain. The scene was repeated throughout the day, as more family and friends arrived. Everyone was trying to support each other, but there was little comfort to be found. Charlie, one of Elvis' closest friends, came into the kitchen around 8 o'clock. He looked exhausted. He told me he was going to the funeral home with Larry Geller, Elvis' hairstylist, to prepare Elvis for the viewing. It was a difficult task, but Charlie felt honored to do it. He broke down a few times, but he did what needed to be done. As the morning wore on, the staff started preparing the house. The living room furniture was moved to the trophy room to make space for the casket. I walked through the trophy room later and saw the furniture piled in a corner. It was a strange sight, a reminder that everything was different now. The sun was shining, but there was a dark cloud over the entire house. Around noon, we got the news that the hearse was on its way. We all tried to act like it wasn't happening, but the reality was sinking in. Elvis had always come home with excitement and joy. This time he was coming home in a hearse. The yard men had worked hard to keep the grounds looking perfect, but it didn't matter now. The hearse pulled up to the back entrance to avoid the crowds out front. We gathered in the backyard, watching silently as the hearse drove around to the front of the house. The casket was brought inside with great effort, placed in the foyer, and then wheeled through the living room to the music room. When the casket was opened, Elvis' head was turned toward the back of the house. The sight of his black hair, swept back over his forehead, was almost too much to bear. Floral arrangements started arriving, filling the house with a heavy scent that only comes with death. The piano where Elvis had played and sung just days before was now hidden behind the casket. It was surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I stood in the dining room, watching everything unfold. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to pay my respects. I waited until the room was empty, and then walked slowly toward the casket. Al Strada, Elvis' wardrobe assistant, joined me, and we approached the casket together. Elvis was home, but he wasn't the Elvis we knew. He was gone, and the house was never going to be the same. We all had to find a way to carry on, but nothing would ever be the same again. It was a most uncomfortable time for both of us. Al went slightly in front of me and stopped, glanced at his friend, and then almost immediately went over to the side to adjust where some flowers had been placed. I was left standing in front of Elvis, alone with my thoughts. Many people have asked what he looked like, and what I was thinking at that moment. I can't really do justice to either of those questions. Elvis didn't look like the Elvis I knew. I wanted to say he looked at peace, but I wasn't sure if that's what I saw or what I wanted to see. He had been fighting so many battles with illnesses in the last few years, and I just wanted him to be okay now. His face and body looked thinner, and I noticed right away that he was dressed in a coat and tie, which was unusual. Elvis usually wore casual clothes when I saw him. I remembered all the times I had folded his sweaters and put them in his dresser, or checked his jumpsuits to make sure they were perfect. I never thought that one day he would be dressed in a coat and tie, lying in a casket in front of me. As I stood there, questions flooded my mind. Could I have done something to prevent his death? Was there a warning sign I missed? I guess it's normal to wonder these things when someone close to you dies. I felt a deep sense of loss, and a flood of memories came rushing back. We had so many good times together, and I realized how much I would cherish those memories. Thankfully, happy thoughts helped me keep my composure. I imagined Elvis in heaven smiling down on us and saying, "Don't be so sad, I'm out of all my pain now." I think a little smile may have appeared on my face, even though I hoped no one saw it. I became aware of other people coming into the room to pay their respects. After I paid mine, I went back to the kitchen, where the staff was busy preparing food. The mansion was full of people, and the hustle and bustle helped keep our minds off the events of the last 2 days. There were so many details to take care of, and it felt like a tourniquet for our grief. Vernon decided to allow a public viewing later that afternoon. He planned to let fans file by the casket, which would be placed just inside the front door for 2 hours. The security team was worried. They feared that thousands of emotional fans could cause chaos or even a riot. They had to make sure no one got too close to Elvis or took photos. Despite the concerns, the viewing went ahead. There were a few incidents, like people fainting from the heat, but the security team did an amazing job. They protected Elvis, just like they had done when he was alive. We all took turns sitting at the dining room table, watching the fans say goodbye. It was a cross-section of America, young and old, men and women, rich and poor. I realized how much Elvis meant to his fans. I saw the depth of their pain, and it made me understand how remarkable he was. I watched as medical personnel helped fans who had fainted from the heat, and I heard them reassure people that they could come back after they were treated. The crowd was so large that Vernon decided to extend the viewing time. He wanted as many fans as possible to have a chance to say goodbye. He broke down in tears, saying, Elvis would want us to let as many fans through as possible. It was a tough decision, but eventually the gates had to be closed as darkness approached. The family had a private viewing planned, and they needed time to prepare. When the gates finally closed, there were still tens of thousands of fans waiting outside. We were worried about a riot, but the police managed to control the crowd. It was a painful end to a long, emotional day. By the time Thursday rolled around, it was clear that Elvis was really gone. The shock and disbelief were turning into the realization that he would be laid to rest that day. I arrived at work early, driving slowly through the crowd of fans gathered in front of Graceland. It took me 15 minutes to get through, with fans parting to let me in. Uncle Vester opened the gate, and I drove up the driveway, feeling a strange sense of loss. The house looked different that morning. Cars were parked everywhere, and the atmosphere was heavy with grief. I went inside and spoke to Pauline and Mary, who were already preparing food for the day. I then checked on Grandma, who was sitting in her rocking chair with Aunt Delta. They both had been crying, but Grandma was holding it together. I made my way through the house, cleaning and trying to keep everything presentable. The past 2 days had been chaotic, with hundreds of people coming and going. I felt a strong sense of obligation to keep the house looking its best, just as Elvis would have wanted. Later, I saw Parker come into the house. He met with Vernon in the dining room. I brought them something to drink and noticed papers on the table. Later, I found out that the Colonel had talked Vernon into signing over control of Elvis merchandise rights. I always felt that Vernon wasn't in the right state of mind to make such decisions that day. The day was long and filled with a mix of sadness and the overwhelming love for Elvis from his fans. It was a day I would never forget. The day Elvis died, Aunt Delta, with some help from Vernon and Grandma, decided to lock up the whole second floor of the house. This was Elvis' private space, where he would go to be alone. There was only one door leading upstairs, and Aunt Delta changed the lock, keeping the only key herself. If anyone needed to go up, they had to ask her for the key. The family said they were doing this out of respect, so no one could see where Elvis had died, but Vernon had another reason. He didn't trust many people, especially after Elvis' death. He was afraid someone might steal Elvis' things. Vernon even thought someone might have killed Elvis, and he believed this until the day he died. Once the upstairs was locked, it stayed that way. No one slept there anymore, and only a few people had access to it. It was like a secret fort, guarded tightly. After making sure everything looked good, I went back to the kitchen to help prepare food. We knew a lot of people would come to the house, so we started cooking whatever we could find. We made spaghetti, salads, barbecue, fried chicken, green beans, sandwiches, and lots of hors d'oeuvres. It was so hot and humid that we put out every drink we could find. We tried to go to the grocery store a few times, but the fans outside made it hard to get food. People were everywhere, and it was almost impossible to leave. Local restaurants and family friends sent food, and a helicopter even brought some supplies. It was the first time I'd seen a helicopter up close, and it felt like the whole world was showing their respect to Elvis. We fed so many people that day we lost count. But we hadn't thought about the police officers, sheriff's deputies, and paramedics who were there for security. They were worried about a riot, and many of them were working for free just to honor Elvis. Elvis had been a deputy sheriff, and they considered him one of their own. As the day went on, we started making takeout plates for the officers outside. We took turns delivering food to them on golf carts. They were all very grateful, and it felt good to help. Around 2 p.m., the funeral home officials started gathering everyone in the den. Grandma, Aunt Delta, Lisa Marie, Priscilla, and Vernon were escorted to the front row, right in front of Elvis' casket. The casket was in the living room, and the furniture had been moved to make space for folding chairs. It was so crowded that the house felt like an oven, even with the air conditioning on full blast. In the den, I saw James Brown, George Hamilton, Anne Margaret, and Roger Smith. Normally, seeing these stars would have been amazing, but not today. The mood was too heavy. We could hear the funeral service from the kitchen, but it was hard to focus with all the noise. I went to a small storage room to listen better. I leaned against an ice machine for support. The service seemed to go on forever, and the heat was intense. I don't remember much of what was said, but I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of loss. The thought that I would never see Elvis smile or hear his voice again was too much to bear. When the service ended, the mourners were directed to the hearse. The front door opened, and a blast of hot air rushed in. The pallbearers struggled to carry the heavy casket through the door and into the hearse. As this happened, a large tree branch suddenly broke and shattered on the ground. It was a strange and unexplainable moment. The funeral procession was organized, and everyone was assigned to a car. The hearse led the way, followed by a long line of vehicles. We watched on a small monitor in the kitchen as the hearse drove down the driveway and out the front gates. The crowd was silent, and the only movement came from photographers trying to get one last photo. As the hearse passed by, every law enforcement officer saluted. It was a fitting tribute to a man who had always loved law enforcement. The procession turned onto Elvis Presley Boulevard, heading to the cemetery where Elvis would be buried next to his mother. Watching the hearse drive away, I finally realized that Elvis was really gone. Everything leading up to that moment had been so surreal, and we had all been so busy that it hadn't fully sunk in. But now, as the last car disappeared from view, the weight of his loss hit me hard. I stood there in a trance, feeling an emptiness that seemed overwhelming. The phone rang, jolting me back to reality. Someone else answered it, and I was left to process my grief. Over the next few days, life at Graceland slowly started to get back to some kind of normal. Elvis' family still lived there, and the house needed to be maintained. Vernon still had his office, and business had to continue. Bills needed to be paid, and fans still wrote asking for pictures. Lisa Marie would still visit. We had to keep the house comfortable for everyone, just as Elvis would have wanted. It was never the same, but we did our best. A sense of loss lingered, and for a long time I found myself speaking in hushed tones, as if Elvis had just died. Strange things started happening after Elvis was gone. I'm not one to believe in the supernatural, but I heard and saw things that were hard to explain. Others in the house experienced the same things. I had been told by the maids that Elvis' mother, Gladys, still inhabited the house, making sure Elvis was being taken care of. Minnie-Me had also heard and seen things that convinced her of this. Life went on, but it was different. Elvis was no longer physically with us, but his presence was still felt in unexpected ways. Nancy had always been skeptical. She didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural things. But after several months of strange occurrences at Graceland, her doubts started to fade. She began hearing footsteps upstairs when she knew no one was there. Sometimes, she'd hear a faint voice calling from an empty room. It got to the point where she'd talk to herself, hoping someone was listening. "I know you're here, Mrs. Gladys, and that's okay," she'd say, then look around to make sure no one saw her talking to thin air. Elvis's unusual experiments didn't help. He tried burning candles and incense to communicate with Gladys, filling the house with an eerie smell. Nancy spent hours cleaning up the mess, worried he'd burn the house down. But the strangest things happened after Elvis died. About 2 weeks after the funeral, Nancy was cleaning the TV room in the basement. She heard the laundry room door slam shut, and the air moved in a way that made her feel like someone was there. She rushed to the door, expecting to find Aunt Delta or Charlie, but the room was dark and empty. Nancy felt a chill. How could she explain something she didn't understand? Another night, Nancy lay down in the trophy room, feeling dizzy. As she closed her eyes, she felt someone pulling on her foot. She thought it was Aunt Delta, but the room was empty. The lights in the trophy cases would flicker on and off by themselves. The doorbell would ring with no one there, and the kitchen light would sway for no reason. Nancy knew people would think she was crazy, but these things really happened. Vernon was worried about Elvis and Gladys's graves at Forest Hill Cemetery. One night, 3 men tried to steal Elvis's body. Vernon decided to move them to Graceland, where he could keep them safe. He chose the meditation garden, a quiet spot Elvis loved. But rezoning the property and getting permission took time and money. Vernon was determined, though. He said, "I need to bring my son and his mama home." The move happened on a Sunday evening, October 2nd. 2 white hearses and 2 limos drove through the back gates of Graceland. Nancy watched as workmen dug the graves and lowered the vaults. She felt an eerie chill when she looked into Elvis's vault. The sun reflected a golden glint off the copper walls, making her jump back. Vernon was still grieving. He drove to the cemetery to oversee the removal of the caskets. He had always known Elvis didn't want to be buried in the ground, but he couldn't afford a mausoleum. Burial in the ground was safer, he thought, but it was a hard decision. Vernon also wanted to bring Jesse, Elvis's twin brother who died at birth, home. Jesse was buried in an unmarked grave in Priceville Cemetery, Tupelo. Vernon and the family made 2 trips to find Jesse's grave. They wanted the family to be together again. Nancy didn't know if the strange things at Graceland were real or just her imagination. But she knew one thing for sure. Graceland was a place where memories lived on, and the love of a family never died.